Good morning. This is September 4th on a Friday. I would like to take some time to make a couple of my comments and also suggestions ever since February when I started this kind of in the use of YouTube and other formats to to bring ourselves back to the oral traditions of education. And I take this seriously in looking back over this thousands of years when we talk about much of the writing from the Chinese thinkers, philosophers like Confucius, Lao Tzu, uh, and by way of India, Buddha, and we have read often from all the Greek philosophers, thinkers like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and all others. As like any human, and for the love of education or love to learn or the curiosity, and that's where the term sophist coming in. Sophist is just a person love and curious about life. And then philos in Greek is life. So when you talk about philosophy, is anyone who care for the learning and loving of life. So philosophy or philosophers, we should make it into a very popular area. 90% of the people do like their lives, their families, and their surroundings and their culture. We love music. We love to be entertained. But what is very important at this particular time and point, put in the framework of the current global culture, this is the learning culture no longer limited to the elites of the doctorals or the PhDs and of the master's degree and all others. This particular time and moment, because the dynamics and the tools of learning, like we are now doing, is becoming very much an open format. I personally cannot afford living in the US and listening only to the American broadcast news. Regionally, yes, but in a broader scale, with the impact of news and events on the global front, I never imagined I have taken my daily read of news, a larger segment of it from the news from Taiwan. And for the longest time, taking my personal bias, I have engaged people from Taiwan during my days growing up, Brazil, here in the US. Um, it's one ethnic as another province group, but never thought of Taiwan will come up today with such prominence of their news reporting. And this is just a simple perspective, not that I have changing gear. The Americans, yes, is the last 75 years, the post-war, the status of the influence of America, the power of the American, when 75% of the world were destroyed. As a teenager, as a 5 years old, landed into Macau from Shanghai. In my entire life, just by the way I play my music, in the use of a guitar, or the American songs. Thinking back, where did I learn my song Dixie? Here playing in Wisconsin, some of the people even laughing, Paul, where did you come up with the Dixie? Well, believe it or not, it's a good memory from one of the first American movies, Gone with the Wind. Old Black Joe is one of my favorite songs and still holds to my heart my sympathy, my emotion, my humanist side of the story. And then you're talking about Red River Valley. You're talking about Oh Susanna. You're talking about the Old Kentucky Home. And then moving up to the 50s, 60s, from the era of the American classics to the platters, we can use music as a gauge where we acquire awareness first of the American culture before even speaking the language. But later on, you learn the lyrics, you learn the words, you learn the languages. And moving up to the era of Elvis Presley, and then we're coming into the era of the Beatles, the Beach Boys, the Monkees, and so on and so forth until I came to college in America, because basically tuning into the songs written by Pete Seeger, sung by Peter Paul and Mary. Where Have All the Flowers Gone? It's a very continued to be a song that affected my arrival into the college in the US 1967 with the greatest reluctance, because my love and affection for Brazil. However, I have never disobeyed my mother's wish. When she left for the US to take care of my sister here in Chicago, Mom just gave me a fair warning. Get yourself going to college in the US. So the influence of the American in the 75 years, the lingua franca, which, by the way, I know more than one of the major lingua franca is when I was a youngster in Macau, learning saying Mass in Latin. And when we do also singing the Latin in the use of the Gregorian chant. So this exposure of the linguistics, I have spoken on the other tapes and about the early sounds from my Shanghai birthplace, and the sounds in the up and down river of the Yangtze with that dialects used by my wet nurse, servants, maids. They're coming from Hangzhou, they're coming from Suzhou, they're coming from the Pudong area, which was a poor area of Shanghai. Now, this is all in the bits and pieces because my sisters speak fluently in Shanghai, which I don't, but I understood 90% because I was raised with the Shanghai ambience until I was age 5. Then I was, quote unquote, smuggled back into Hong Kong to rejoin my family by way of Macau. And the mother tongue is Cantonese by my mom, but my mom also raised in Guilin, in Guangxi, and she carries 3 other dialects in her handling of Cantonese and of the called Gunhua in Cantonese, meaning the official language is in her time and moment of the official language of the court, which today is Pudonghua. But each one and every one of us have our influence by the localism, by the regional sound, hearing, and pronunciation. So these multiple tongues of language had incubated, had given me a good base. Even among my dear friends I speak Spanish with, and they came to Brazil, do their presentations after they try very hard to speak their Portuguese in about an hour, 45 minutes. When they come down from the podium, just give me a big answer. Oh my God, thank God I can went back to Spanish, because they find it difficult a certain kind of sound and format. For example, we can say easily in Spanish called San Francisco, São Paulo, São Pablo, but to say the Portuguese sound, São Paulo, San Pedro, the nasal, I picked up minor influence. The intonation gave me the background from the language dialect of the Shanghai. So linguistically, I'm most fortunate. And I'm also very lucky to be able to composing in this prefix suffix radical composition in the Latin language, mainly Portuguese, had allowed me to the adaptation into both Spanish and Italian. And I do it myself, even like translating a document, as I do in Facebook almost daily, using Google Translate. But when I do the language in Italian, I make sure myself listen onto the pronunciation and the expressions, even in Google Translates. So learning is a daily happening, and this multiculturalism and this cross-cultural journey I have in my life is what bring me more today to paying attention to the new global communication format, a new global education platform, such as now I'm using the platform Google, and I'm studying what to do with Patreon, and also who the hell knows, we may having our own group in the using in the broadcast for the open books and using Vimeo or any other um, sound provider, uh, because in what have envisioned the fostering teaching in the open books, which is a system that heavily will become a system of blockchain. What is a blockchain? That's a new terminology. But in my use, when we are talking about this particular moment, we're talking about the subject matter. In between, if I have insert any ideas or event, and that particular event may not be accurate, accurate. And so what I would do is have imagine an hour later, this communication will be come out in print. I know Google can do that, but they should do this with more frequency and higher frequency so people can print out the entire presentation. And by open books, I'm inviting all people to print a document and to insert in that particular moment, like say 3 minutes and 14 seconds, a particular word I used to creating a question and doubt, and very well used to be the future translation of languages. If this is being done in English, the Chinese audience can just insert into that particular word they do not understand, or the phrase by highlighting it and putting a demand of the slang or the colloquial language used. For example, here in America, we talk about, wow, this is great. You know, this gentleman, he hit it out of the park. Well, they're relating to baseball. How many Chinese really understand baseball, or Brazilians, or Argentinians, or Chileans? But in that particular phraseology, they can just highlight it, insert it. Of course, this can be done in the college level, university level. If this is being done in a class of communications, speeches, whatever, and this particular lecture, this particular presentation can be using by that lecture, and they may find, oh, Paul using a particular language or particular new words as I have been creating. Those are new terminologies, such in the terms of thinkology. Well, from thinkology, when I turn thinkology, is making people think more. Why I have created thinkology? Because when I'm advocating conscience, where I have found conscience cannot be taught. And yet, at the very same time, for the last 3,000 plus years, I'm using the reference of the Chinese language by the discovery of the oracle bones on the Shang Dynasty, and which had evolved, continue on for the longest time. The discoveries happened to be 1800s, when the bones and the tortoise shells were found with inscriptions. But what I'm trying to say, with this kind of a learning and the linguistic learning, anybody can insert, I don't understand that word. You may find 1 million participants. If we have that format ready, they will insert to give you the meaning of that word. Other people will give you how to use the phraseology, the sentence form. If I want to say, how can I use this dragon character, dragon, into a flying dragon, in a water dragon? Teaching, learning will become an absolute new collaborative effort. And the open book is the open book for all. And then we will find institutions and professors and teachers, participants become categorized into the good use of everyday information, as we are doing now, and then with the insertion of the open books format, which happens to become a tool in the contemporary AI era or digital era, which is a screener, which is a filter. Because if I, for whatever reason, which is not for real for some people, I'm opening to the insertion by someone and say, Paul, what you have just spoken, be that an event, be that my bias stance, my personal stance with the Palestine issue, which I think is a colonial war at this point, or I talk about Ukraine with my bias with Russia by not knowing the extensive time historically where my other sympathy feels with the cluster of the emergent Slavic culture between Russia and Belarus and the Ukraine, and the influx and influences with other ethnic groups. What I'm really sharing in the very raw form, okay, called the Learning Primitivity 101. How can we learn? Because only by way of education we can clarify our own ignorance, what we did not know, what we did not being able to generate the empathy or the sympathy. As I just said, I'm for the Russian side because what I read about history for those last 17 years, ever since 1991, what I recall in bits and pieces about Ronald Reagan with his Secretary of State Baker in Berlin when Gorbachev terminated the Warsaw Pact, meaning the entire Slavic bloc, the former Soviet Union, to fight the West. And over time, I have seen in the news where Yeltsin, including Putin, were trying to have Russia, the post-Soviet, to become a part of NATO. And the most vivid memory is where Reagan has said in Berlin, 1991, we will not move 1 inch east of Berlin. Now, is that a political bullshit statement? Because Reagan had accelerated the spending, the economy, the money onto the speeding, the race of the arms with Russia. And many have credited Reagan's policy, Soviet Union. So all this puzzling by many, but I take the words of the US, if we dare, that this last, since 1991, over 18 countries had joined NATO. And the West had demonized the Soviet Union. Now, don't get me wrong. All of a sudden, my mind goes into why the U.S. is flexing muscles, creating banana republics, the U.S. hegemony, the Monroe Doctrine. I grew up in that part of Brazil. I saw the military state change. Allende fall in 1973, 64, even the Brazilians overthrown the regime of João Goulart. I was only a teenager, but I recall, and I just questioning, well, where did this 6, 7 Chinese come from? They were provoking a revolution in Brazil. Well, eventually, we found out everything had been demonized. In the 64, U.S. also have an aircraft carrier in the Guanabara Bay. Now, these are the bits and pieces, and people say, no, Paul, you're biased. Maybe you're heading into the Chinese zone, or whatever comment. Why I think education is to be able to give me a peripheral view that I cannot afford. I only come from one dimension as a teenager, only can one dimension about the American influence of the military regimes in Chile, later on Argentina, later on Che Guevara killed in Bolivia, or the military regime in Latin America, you just wonder and say, why is that U.S. talk about democracy, and yet with money, military, arm, to have created so many dictatorship? News today, you can Google and find out Batista had left Cuba with $600 million cash. Why the revolution of Fidel Castro? Why is the input of Che Guevara? So one comment comes out is that it's not because Che Guevara and Fidel Castro. The entire Havana, by the corruption of Batista and Meyer Lansky, one of the few ethnic Jewish mafia linking to the New York mob, will make Cuba into a two-color, two-tier society. The rich, affluent white, the plutocracy of wealth will make the other not whites to become servants and whatnot in that rank and file in Cuba. So many of you may say you're taking a very biased view. No, I have no reason, but I always like to question what I don't see on the other side. As I just recently mentioned, by what I'm reading a little bit more about Belarus, the Belarusians, the Russians, and the Ukrainians, and that makes why Putin did not bomb Kiev, because they have a deepest respect, one of the richest, most extended culture in the development of the three groups, South, maybe I'm right or wrong, Eastern Slavics, and that's the division of the Slavic nation. And so I gain a little bit more empathy and sympathy and sentiments with the situation in Ukraine. I'm educating myself on a daily basis. And this is what is happening. I'm just describing the mechanics of today in the use of video, in the use of taping, maybe sharing my story. The oral history is coming back. And to allow this oral history to be critiqued, to add on, to challenge, to define, and to make my presentation more accurate, only can be done when this is being tape recorded into the written form. Now, regardless, Google can do it or not. There are other AI companies in China, including Huawei, where I have heard if I can manage to delay my every word and sentences with 1/60th of a second, the next space can be filled in by the simultaneous broadcasting. So technology is happening in a very amazing phase. We are now in this era because with greater clarity, we have less conflict. With less conflict, we have less abuse of the military-industrial complex, very fairly warned by Dwight Eisenhower. He's such a chicken shit, only given that his speech a day before he leaving his office. What if this trillions of dollars of defense can be put into the alleviation of poverty instead building this thousands of nuclear arsenals that we know we can be totally pulverized of the entire planet Earth? Now, this is in thinking alone, going back to the terminology, thinkology. When I switch that into the Hispanic, the Roman Latin language, which I create another trademark called Romantina, we talk about pensacologia in Spanish, because the word think is piensa, P-I-E-N-S-A. But in Italian, it's pensacologia. And in Portuguese, it's pensacologia. And in French, if I don't pronounce it right or wrong, pensacologie. And this can be applied to Roman, for the Romanian and other related, the Romance language, like those who speak Gallego in Galicia. And so language is evolving. Language is dynamic. And let's put thinkology back to the context of the Latin roots, make it more classical, make it like a Renaissance. We can call it pensacology. So the American group someday will learn about pensacologia, and now you can have pensacology. I'm relating from English, modified to the Latin, and bring it back to the English domain. Sounds more compatible because you learn about pensacology, you will think about the other three languages. The reason of this language development as a cross-cultural product myself, I'm finding myself most fortunate if I can do this Romance language in groups, Romantina / Romancina. That means also Roman and Chinese. If I took the dictionary, just like English, Chinese. So the Chinese access to the American English language into, for example, I used to always use the word station, train station. And then if they click in Romantina or the entire 4 or 5 languages, not just only those 4 or 5, anyone come close to the pensacologia, you will see, they will see that in Italian, they will see that in French, pensacologie or pensacologie, I pronounce it right or wrongly, pensacologia in Spanish, and pensacologia in Portuguese. So you learn one word from English, from Chinese to English, but clicking Romantina, you will see the entire descendant in many cases, or what come close to that term. The word train station, I'm using just very simple, estazione in Italian, estação in Portuguese, estación in Spanish, and I'm very sure if I say estación in French, they will understand. What about in Galicia? Same thing. Estación, estação, or Romania. And what I'm talking about in what I have established is my challenge, my defiance to the old language, the collective language. When even a little mind block. When the former creator of the universal language had engaged also Slavic language, Polish, Russian, the Cyrillic language. What I'm doing, because the progress, we can take a little bit and removing even the Germanic, even the Russian, the Slavic languages, and that's Romantina, because the Romantina alone, look at the number they were speaking Romantina, using the dictionary called Romantina, Romancina. First you learn English and Portuguese. And the next, Chinese. Next, you have the other 4 languages. There's 600 million people in the Franco zone, the French zone, and predominantly in North Africa by the French colony, which the French are still exploiting by their banking of the chaos in North Africa. But that will be changing soon. Next group is Spanish in Latin America, and that's including Spain, is about 400 million. And Portuguese is about 300 million, including Portuguese Africa, Brazil, and Portugal. And Italian, give and take, which I'm still not articulating, but you will come into the picture soon, is about 150, 200 million. But if you add all that together, that's 1.3 billion. Well, Chinese is 1.4. Indian language is 1.4. The Arabic language is 1.3. English is about 1.6, 1.5, because the most used, because English remained to be the lingua franca, the conqueror's language, just like the Romans. And that's how Latin, when they turned into vulgar Latin, in that time, vulgarity, the vulgar Latin, that's not how we apply to the language today. That means that they are not traditional Latin in the format of the Romans. From the Vulgar Latin, we have Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, and all we are evolving in linguistics. Look at the beautiful part of how the Italians started Renaissance. They embraced the old culture of the Greeks and finding out what they have missed by not learning by what they have missing the Greek influence. Dante Alighieri wrote the first book in Italian. That is the Divine Comedy. And when will American or English to go through another period of Renaissance? How would that be contributing to the aesthetic beauty of the language, of the architecture, of the entire Renaissance that also have influenced eventually the navigation of the Portuguese and by the engagement of the Chinese Silk Road into the Ottoman Empire? And what will be now, what is happening now is a Chinese cultural renaissance. But the Chinese not looking back, but by gaining their confidence. Unlike the Indians, in my life, the 50 years, to be able to command the language of English, you have a lot of prestige. You have gained a lot of insights and also respect. But just by sitting in a restaurant in Hong Kong, which I stayed for 15 years in Sheraton, when I'm asking for the glass of water, often I've been ignored. When I change into English, believe it or not, the attitude change. To notice this delicate psychological dynamic changes, because when you are commanding English in the earlier days, I assume this is also in India, in Thailand, in Indochina, you are speaking the language of a former dominator. If you speak it with a little bit more what we have advocating in the teaching of psychology, to speak your language with more assertion, be that you have the eye contact, be that your hand gesture. I borrowed this from my early childhood from the Italians in Brazil and the Italian priests I grew up with. You can see, you make that attention of the waiter and the wait staff changing the attitude. And yet I hated it. Why can't I get the same respect when I say that in Chinese? Because we just gone through the 100 freaking years called humiliation by the goddamn opium. Respect comes with how you use the language. And I feel a double betrayal that I have to use the language of a conqueror, a dominator by power, to gain respect. And this is changing. And I'm really happy that 600 million Chinese engage now in the languages and predominantly English. And unlike the Indians, don't get me wrong, I'm not putting this into a better or worse. In the use of the English that I see in the Chinese diplomatic corps, and then when I see the Chinese businessmen around the globe, and also tremendously from the Cantonese section in Hong Kong, English become a tool, no more, no less. And the fluency in the use of Mandarin is gaining greater respect. Yes, it is a changing of times. And I hope don't take me this a little bit of a emotionality expression, because it is sensitive for who are bicultural, tricultural, quadricultural, multicultural backgrounds. With the fluency of the language, you gain more. And this is part of the education that I'm sharing because I went through this process. So what I'm advocating in this particular series, this particular hour that I'm sharing, with my audience who share with me with the development I just started 2 weeks ago, and the book is being written called The Pedagogy of Conscience, where I have discovered conscience has been around forever, but conscience cannot be taught. And yet, one of the best example is the entire history of the Chinese, with all the thinkers, philosophers, and writers. The advocacy is about conscience. So I'm becoming more and more mature and less timid about the subject, about the topic I'm speaking. Along the way, I have also inserted my 45 years history in the gemstone mineral business. And predominantly, I have that business fully engaged to the world, but my base had always been from Brazil, from an urbanite, from a Paulistano who lived in Sao Paulo, and going up north to the hinterlands, first Minas, Bahia, Goiás, Amazon, Amazonas, Goiânia, and meeting the different tribal groups. My life has been enriched by my second home, which is Brazil, and by the language I have learned, and by the body language had expanded my language into three other Latin-based languages. My father was French fluent, but I never took on French because my misgivings, my personal disharmony with my dad. But I have always respected my father's command of language. And for the young man who traveled twice by way of Trans-Siberia, by way of Moscow, Berlin, to go to France with the same mission to make China modernized, westernized, and I thank him for all the wonderful, marvelous romance novels, starting with Victor Hugo to the rest of the English from Dickens, including Mark Twain and other literature, Dumas. It's omnipresence in my household since I was 6, 7 years old. That's one part of the language, and I regret I do not have the command of French, but I can read, I can do my best into still educating myself with the French language. And what I'm saying here, the language barriers today can be totally changed by technology. I will have to learn to speak a little slower, give a tempo 1/60 a second or 1/30 a second. And then that space can be filtered in the future into any language, maybe any of the 180 languages without counting the indigenous language, what I have encountered in Latin America or in Africa. But we can changing by way of technology. Every speaker will give them the reach for the global audience. And that is just advancing knowledge and advancing human engagement and better understanding. And that's possible to make the world a great deal more harmonious. What China is doing with their alleviation of the poor and the Silk Road is basically applying the same strategy into Africa. I created in the Latin word the Silk Road in Spanish and Portuguese 5 years ago. I used what the Silk Road to turn into Casela. Casela, Casela, meaning Camino de Seda Latina America. Well, this means it's not quite, maybe a little Americanized, Latin America, just to make the phonetic sound Casela, .net, .net. As a cross-cultural person, I enjoy my global travel, my engagement from tribal region in the Amazons to the urban cities, from Tokyo, New York, China, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Frankfurt. By the way, I never set foot in London. It's just part of the reason what marked in my mind about the Opium War. I passed through Heathrow. I've gone through flight transfers by way of London 16 times. but I have yet set foot into England. Not about grudge. I'm not, that's not the case. Just a personal. And by the same token, I have visited Shanghai with a minimum of cases. Another reason, I was born in a French concession. I bear with me a certain kind of shame of the city of Shanghai. So I'm at least being a equitarian, being giving both discount of points from Shanghai to London. Okay, even Hong Kong. I'd rather be in Macau or be in Zhuhai, but Hong Kong come by. I feel I'm living in a matchbox unless I pay my then $150 a night in Sheraton Hotel or in the 4-star, 5-star hotel range. But at any rate, this tape, this particular time and moment is to encourage the entire world community to take on the AI, to take on the speed of the algorithm, the quantum count. I am doing that daily in what I put in my context of the circumstances about China, about Shanghai, about war, about Reagan and Gorbachev. In less than 3 minutes, by my count, they're using ChatGPT. They came back up with me with this well summarized. This is the perspective. I hope I bring it to my group, my friends, my audience. We are moving into that called spatial web. What is a spatial web? If I'm talking one facet, like a tubular, which I will do eventually with graphics by way of Canva, you are not seeing only one side, which is China, US, whatever, a historical event. You are seeing in the tubular, in the angles where we can share. I just share with the other Chinese and say, do you know the American company, ethnic Jewish company, have funded the Japanese entry into China? Because one of the biggest disturbance, the greatest harm, the most painful period of China is when the students started the May 4th movement. That was because after the First World War, China, as part of the victor teams, the winning team of Europe, by Chinese sending labor into London, into Paris. I'm a little vague on that. Never participated in war. Instead, when Germany was beaten, instead returning the German possession of Qingdao, we all love the Qingdao beer, many of you do, but the city of Qingdao and the province of Shandong, instead returning to China as part of the alliance, the European decided to give Qingdao and Manchuria to Japan. And that even has started to give the Japanese ambition to take China, with the other intention of Europeans, at what time we do not know, is preparing Japan to take on the path of Manchuria, marching into Russian Siberia. So what was China? We are nothing but a piece of the dirt from the eyes of the European. And look at this treatment. And in between this, I just noticed one of the small news coming to me, and part of the funding of the Japanese coming into China was by the family Schiff from the US, from Wall Street, part of the team, family members of the Rothschild group. So when are we going to be able to identify all the villains? And by the same time, I also speak of the good of the nation invaded China when the English dominated Shanghai, appointed an ethnic Irish to take care of their custom with both import tax and export tax, that Irish gentleman literally had given the kind of revenue to the Manchu dynasty in the most formidable way, because the past corruptions were always muddy and confusing about the revenue generating from the import export, even under the colonization dictated by the Brits. So we can talk about China had learned tremendously from the humiliation, from the mistreatment, and from the poison of opium, which the Chinese will never forget, nor the Chinese will forget about the Sino-Japanese War. But all had started after the Versailles Treaty. And by the way, the Chinese ambassador sent to Versailles from Shanghai had never signed the Versailles Treaty. Here, just a little bit of a reminder, the importance of languages, the importance, why I pick up reading news bits and pieces, had helped me to see a broader spectrum of every issue, because it is spiral now. If you look at the tubular, look at the spiral in time events. That is part of me in seeing what is called the spatial web that's ahead of us. If you look at the Chinese map, you can put a map in dimensions in every dynasty. You can see instead of one dimension, you can see in the multiple dimensions of the expansion of the land by the Qing Empire, and also by the expansion and the Manchu rulers all the way to the west into the Mongolia. As we shall find out also when Chinese sharing with me and say, how come I don't have a chagrin? I don't have the kind of anxiety about when the Russian, during the time, China and Russia, when Stalin took over the Outer Mongolia, used to belong to China. But there was the political lines and divisions of the map. But nobody trying to understand amongst the Russians of the percentage of the Mongolian blood in their country, and one of the latest power of the Mongols with the lineage to the king and queens of Russia. Whatever the land dispute where the Russians have felt that was the territory once belonged to their own kin, the Mongols. And understanding is just a good thing to make you understand. I don't have to endorse. I don't have to agree. And that is the same stupidity of the border dispute between India and China. And in the dispute of India and China by Nehru, because he based the Indian territory, including the British intrusion, called the McMahon Line, which taken part of the southern Tibet, the autonomous region of China, into the Indian territory. And even in that war in 1962, China's relationship with Khrushchev has started to be worsening. And both the US and the Russians, or Soviet Union, were on the side of the Indians. So I think this kind of perspective, where I have the fortune to be able to read things in different language, listen to different stories, and by what we can create is understanding. By all means, I'm not here to become punitive or castigating the Russian taking part of the Outer Mongolia and part of the Indian taking claim by Nehru of their land taken by the conquered by the colonialists of the British, where the British is still laying much of the pain and agony in Indochina, in Southeast Asia. That may be part of the reason I do not set foot into London. So to make this the end of my presentation, I hope this will ignite more learning, because more learning will make us have a great understanding. You do not have to endorse what I do or my emotional sentiments about India, about Russia, about the British, and but by way I'm speaking of the Russian claim of their right of the lineage and the blood link to the Mongols, and I think they have the right. And also, Lenin is the first one who said they will try to do their best to ceding the land grabbed by the Tsar Russia, by the Russian Empire to the Chinese. But in bits and pieces, look at Vladivostok, look at the situation, the Chinese-Russian collaboration in Siberia with the pipes and all that, the oil pipes, the gas pipes. I think if we can find a way to collaborate, and the alliances that build, I'm speaking that with total bias. The Chinese alliances was never based on nationalism or based on hatred. I take pride that we know the language of the hearts. We have been speaking the language of conscience for the longest time. We have no reason for the Chinese want to become another commander in the new Monroe Doctrine in Latin America or in Africa. I think the economic advancement, collaboration to lift up the living standard of people and to reduce poverty is what I am 100% with the current policy by Xi from China. And I hope the world will be gaining part of this awareness of the human conscience. And the last line I'll repeat: conscience cannot be taught. Conscience coming from thinking. And that's why thinkology, pensacology, pensacologia is all coming into this salada mista, mixed salad of my thinking. Have a good day. Gustavo.